From the day that he was elected that evening, when he came out in the balcony and didn't wear some of the regalia that was normally worn, simply dressed as a bishop, addressed the people of Rome as their bishop, asked them to pray for him. Just that very first evening, I myself, it was the afternoon here in the States, was listening to the radio and I was just stunned. So I think there's something, the impact initially is the humility of how he goes about leading, the way he sees his office in a more collegial sense, meaning he gone out of his way to say, I'm the Bishop of Rome, I'm the first among all the bishops, but I'm a bishop. So it's a very different model than a monarchical papacy. A common way people put this all the time is that the church is too distant from us people. The problem is church is identified with the hierarchy, the clerics, and from, like I say, the bishops and down. Whereas what this man's trying to do is to do what's fundamentally true about Christianity, and that is to say you're all the church. So to the extent that he's trying to dial down, as it were, the pomp of his own office, and he has this populist way, which clearly people find very authentic, because it is. When I entered the Jesuits, our official name is Society of Jesus, back in 1982, certainly back then we were pretty much told and expected that there'd never be a Jesuit pope. This was an impossibility. And the reason why, most basically, was that the Jesuits in our nearly 500-year history have at times, earlier times, wielded a fair amount of power both in the church but also in many of the European countries and colonies of that last several hundred years. We were actually suppressed in the 18th century for 55 years and then reinstated, which I think is another indicator of how our power at times was so great that it was threatening. So to have a Jesuit pope was a surprise. I mean, to me, I was listening to NPR as this all evolved 2 years ago, and Silvia Poggioli, says that it's, well, he's an Argentinian and he's a Jesuit. And I remember saying, I was in the car, I was like, that's not right. It can't be right. I know you're working on the fly here. So it's a stunning thing that I think, first of all, indicates that the reform of the Jesuits, which has been going on since the 1960s, and that was mandated by the Second Vatican Council, that all the religious orders and congregations really reform and renew themselves back to their basics. I think it's evidence that we've done that we're not perceived as worldly powerful. He will address, I'm sure, first the history, something of the American history, lauding the best of the American experiment, if you will. But we'll move, I'm sure, into precisely these issues again of justice. I suspect he'll build off the whole concept of justice and the concept of the common good. And the common good basically boils down to this, that human societies have an obligation to set up the conditions and sustain common conditions such that every individual person can not only survive, but in some way thrive. The backlash or the reaction has been heightened this year, in 2015, now as he's moved through 2 years of his pontificate. It was always there from the start, rumbling a little bit, because clearly his way of proceeding was to defeat, or at least to curb clericalism, the pompous, exalted state of the hierarchy from cardinals, bishops, right on down to priests. And that, bluntly, we have to say, really contrasts with the previous two popes. They're both men also who were prayerful and who said and did many beautiful things about service, but they very much carried the power of the pomp and the circumstance of the Vatican, and also really promoted that among their bishops and priests in the world, this hierarchical, we would say clerical way of proceeding. So this already, I can honestly report, has caused a lot of friction among men in the hierarchy, right down to bishops and priests. Anecdotally, I can say that a seminarian I was with last summer, by chance, I don't know him personally, but we were talking, and he was saying how he and some of his classmates in seminary were demoralized by this pope. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but the word, his affect was that strong. And saying, well, you know, because he's taking away everything that makes us special. Or I've had another anecdote recounted to me, this is anecdotal things, of a man who accompanies a bishop, and they were in Rome, and the bishop turned to his assistant and said, I don't, what do people see in this guy? Why is there such a crowd here today? My greatest hope is that he will have a great and a sustained and a newer and a deeper impact on the archbishops, bishops, and priests of the United States. The greatest concern I have is for the leadership, and that will continue to change in its own attitude, its compassion, its way of proceeding with the teachings of the Church in a way that's pastoral and available.